Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's episode by episode review of the Orville Season 1. In this video I will go through all the episodes of Season 1 of the Orville to give my thoughts and analysis on each episode. So I'll start with a spoiler warning for up to the end of Season 1 of the Orville. If you haven't seen all of Season 1 you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. Now, I did enjoy the Orville, but I wasn't as impressed with it as many other Star Trek fans seem to be. I, for one, do not like to compare this to a particular other show, which pretty much every other YouTuber loves to do repeatedly, mainly to say that this is the real successor to Star Trek and not that other sucky show. But I personally think that they are two entirely different shows, and to compare them is ridiculous and unnecessary. I did a whole other video about this topic, so I won't get into that too much here. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, I'll drop a link in the description below for that video. Suffice to say here, I personally don't consider the Orville to be Star Trek, and I think it's ridiculous to say that it is, because objectively, it is not. It is clearly a comedy show that parodies Star Trek, and that is not the same thing. But as a comedy parody show, I think it really works. As a Star Trek show, it's trite and unoriginal and repetitive, but parodies don't need to be original, as the whole point is to parody something. So in that context, I quite enjoyed the show. But I'm not as crazy about it as some people seem to be, and when I look back on the show, I think it was pretty good, but not great. It certainly had its moments, and some of the plots were really interesting, and it even made some great social commentary that was the way that Star Trek tends to do, and sometimes the comedy really works, and the chemistry between the characters really gel, and other times the comedy falls really flat and is too juvenile, and the characters can seem a bit too derivative of known characters. I heard one reviewer refer to it as a rehash of Star Trek The Next Generation, but with a bunch of dick and fart jokes, and while I think that assessment is a bit too unfair, I can see where that reviewer is coming from and wouldn't call that a totally inaccurate assessment. A couple of characters, the human ones, mainly the helmsman and navigator, act like the way modern day characters would in a comedy show. And while sometimes I do find that gives a Star Trek type setting a sense of relatability, as we see how average modern day people might react to this fantastical setting, which sometimes can be quite amusing and it adds an interesting perspective to this kind of show. But on the other hand, I think it holds me back from taking this show seriously, which is overall, if I were to consider this show a serious drama and compare it to other sci-fi dramas, I would say that it doesn't hold up at all and it is barely adequate. But through the lens of a comedy parody show, it does succeed in many ways. So anyway, let's jump into the episodes, beginning with the first episode, Old Wounds. Now, this does its job as the first episode, as it introduced all the characters and situations, but watching it now, I can't help but think that this only kind of works because it's a comedy and I don't have to take it seriously. Now, I don't want to sound repetitive and keep harping on this one point, but watching this episode, I couldn't help but think of this the whole time I was watching it. Captain Mercer, Lieutenant Malloy, Commander Grayson, and Lieutenant Lamar were all characters I would never be able to take seriously in any sci-fi drama. Further, the music is very simplistic and stereotypical hero-type music that I find really cheesy, even in comedies. Some of the acting is actually pretty bad in this episode. The action scenes involving the Krill were horrendous and really cartoonish. The one scene in particular where the Krill spy pulls a gun on Mercer and kills the scientist was particularly cheesy and filled with some pretty bad acting. For that matter, the Krill are pretty stereotypical sci-fi villain cliches. I can't take them seriously either. Also, I can't take Seth MacFarlane as the captain seriously. It screams of a huge ego trip to me because it's his show, so I get to be the captain, and I don't think he really works in this role at all. And don't even get me started on the whole storyline about Mercer being assigned his ex-wife as a first officer. I don't think this even works for a comedy show. It has a really cheesy sitcom feel to it, and I can't take it seriously. However, all that being said, there were aspects to this episode I liked, as I like how some of the characters react to typical sci-fi situations in a realistic, modern way. Like, I like when Mercer introduced himself to the crew, Lamar asked if he could drink soda on the bridge. And when Mercer contacted the Krill captain, on the view screen he asked him to move to the center as there was a bit of dead space that was annoying him. I like the moments like that. It brings a sense of levity and relatability. And I like the interesting cast of characters, particularly the alien characters, such as Bortus, who is from a one-gender species, Ilaria, who is from a planet with a denser gravity, which gives her super strength and Earth gravity, and Isaac, an artificial intelligence from a highly advanced species that sees humans as inferior, yet he wants to learn more about them. So this makes a pretty interesting sci-fi, particularly seeing how these characters interact with each other, and these alien characters interact with what are essentially modern sitcom characters. It does make for some entertaining character interactions, I must admit. So I'll give Old Wounds a 5 out of 10. So next episode is Command Performance, which is basically the episode where Mercer and Grayson are put in a zoo by superior aliens that see humans and most other life forms as lesser life forms like animals, so they put them in zoos. I heard someone say that they felt this episode was a ripoff of the Menagerie from Star Trek the original series, and I can definitely see that comparison, but what I thought of was an episode from the Buzz Lightyear cartoon. Yes, there was a cartoon show for Buzz Lightyear in the early 2000s. I used to watch it, and there was an episode that was pretty much exactly like this one, where the main characters got put in a zoo by some smug aliens that thought they were more superior to everyone else. In fact, I think I saw this occur in several cartoons when I was a kid. The Buzz Lightyear one was probably the most recent, which is why it sticks in my memory. And in the event, that's what this comes off as, a cartoon that's just silly. I did enjoy the storyline with Ilaria having to take command of the Orville, although even that could be silly at times, like the whole thing about when she was following orders to abandon Mercer and Grayson and everyone was being a dick to her, but when she announced that she'd break the orders and go rescue them, everyone started cheering and be like, yeah, woo! That was so dumb. Even for a comedy, it was cheesy, over the top, not realistic, didn't buy it at all. And the ending where they exchange Mercer and Grayson for a bunch of reality shows, okay. I must admit that was funny, but at the same time it was stupid, unrealistic, and would then become that these reality shows would then become their biggest attraction. Again, as a series drama, this show sucks, but as a comedy, it's alright. So I'll give this episode a 4 out of 10. So next episode is about a girl. Now I heard many people cite this episode as a shining example of how awesome the Orville is at social commentary and how it's continuing the Star Trek tradition of having awesome social commentary. And yeah, kind of, but not really. I did find this episode a shining example, yet it's kind of okay. I mean, it did, if I'm being honest, feel really derivative of The Measure of the Man, but not a direct ripoff, as many things were different. I personally feel the comedy aspect of the show gets in the way of this episode. For example, the fact that Bortus was convinced to change his mind by watching Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was really stupid. And I do have to admit that I felt at the start that the crew were judging Bortus and his culture by human standards and standards of their own culture, and when Bortus was pointing this out, it seems to me the show was trying to tell me that he was full of shit, and that wasn't the case. And I get that, the point of the episode was to question how far cultural consideration should be taken, but at the start of the episode I feel they were being very obtuse and not giving the question the full consideration it deserved. However, I did feel that did change once Bortus changed his mind and didn't want to force a gender change on his child, and they were totally in the right because they were supporting Bortus. And I found the rest of the trial really interesting, and I like how Commander Grayson actually made a good lawyer and for the most part raised a lot of good points, and the trial felt kind of realistic. They didn't go into like over the top silliness. And the ending where they revealed that one of the planet's greatest writers is in fact a woman, but they decided to force the gender change anyway, was a really thought-provoking ending. Although I will say it was kind of convenient how easily they find this woman who just so happened to be the planet's greatest writer, but whatever. Anyway, I want to give this episode a 7 out of 10. So next episode is For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. No, sorry, I mean it's called If the Stars Should Appear. My mistake. Now, if you didn't catch the joke, For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky is an episode of Star Trek, the original series, where Kirk and crew find an artificial asteroid on course to another planet, which would destroy both of them. But when they beam to the artificial asteroid, they find that it's actually a ship, but everyone living on board doesn't realize it's a ship and thinks it's just the world, and they are ruled by a superior computer that uses religious doctrine to keep them ignorant of this fact and rule over them in an authoritarian manner. So when Kirk and crew have to convince them they're all about to die, they are very resistant to this. In fact, Kirk and the crew get like tortured, and because this goes against their religious beliefs, and they really don't want to see the truth of the matter. And as this sounds really familiar, it's because I just essentially described the plot of this episode of the Orville. Sure, there are a few differences, like For the World is Hollow also had a plot about McCoy having 1 year to live and then falling in love and getting married. And If the Stars Should Appear, the villain was Teabag from Prison Break and not a supercomputer, and also featured an underground that was fighting against religious doctrine. But that doesn't change the fact that these episodes are way too similar, and yes, I would call this episode a ripoff of For the World is Hollow. But that being said, I still did enjoy this episode. I think it was a great getting a modern update to the story, and it was an intriguing concept that was really suspenseful and engaging. My main complaint of this episode was actually that it was resolved too easily, and the underground resistance was a very convenient plot device. Also, I have to mention the scene where they're in an elevator on the alien spaceship and Mercer starts acting all weird and Grayson's like, "Oh my god, you're still weird in elevators." I think of this scene every time I'm in an elevator because I get all weird in elevators too. So again, I love that the show can incorporate little realistic details into the sci-fi setting like this. Also, hey, Liam Neeson's in this episode. How about that? Anyway, so I think I'll give this episode an 8 out of 10. So next episode is Priya, which once again entices us with the star power as a guest stars Charlize Theron. And this episode was kind of meh. I mean, as it was very cliche and predictable. At least in regards of that it had Charlize Theron come on board and all the guys were going crazy for her, particularly Captain Mercer, while Grayson and the woman could tell that she was up to no good, but the men were letting their hormones get in the way, and surprise, surprise, turns out the women were right and she was up to no good. I'm shocked! It's such a cliche story that's been done dozens of times before, including, no less, Star Trek the Animated Series. I mean, at least she wasn't using mind control abilities to entice the men, but honestly, I'm not sure if that would make it any better or worse. And the fact that it has Charlize Theron doesn't make this any better. Sorry. Although, I will say the reveal that she was a time traveler from the future that saved the ship from destruction so she could take it to the future and sell it as an antique was pretty interesting. Also, I actually love the comedy side plot of Malloy trying to teach Isaac how to play practical jokes, and that led to Isaac sewing off Malloy's leg. I did like that a lot, even though it was predictable as well, because as soon as Malloy told Isaac to be creative with his practical joke, I knew he'd do something over the top. But I did love the scene where Malloy admitted to Isaac when he thought that Isaac was dead that it was the best practical joke ever. But I will, something about the ending really didn't sit right with me. And actually the ending didn't make any sense because they made it so they destroyed the wormhole, quantum singularity, whatever the hell technobabble nonsense to make it so she never time traveled in the past, so she disappeared like as soon as they destroyed it. But that makes no sense because the Orville was meant to get destroyed, and she traveled back in time and saved them. So if they erased it, so it made it so that she never traveled back in time, then the Orville would be destroyed. Also, she said they were talking like, oh, like Mercer wouldn't remember her, yet after she disappeared, they were acting like he did remember anything. So this is a horrible use of time travel, I do have to say. Oh, and by the way, watching Seinfeld on the bridge, but again, this is something I can give the show leeway for because it's a comedy parody show. But if it wasn't, and you'd expect me to take this as a serious Star Trek drama, it would totally suck. But since it's a comedy, I can give it a pass. So ultimately, this episode was decent, so I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. So next episode is Krill, and this episode does expand the Krill more and make them come off as a more believable and realistic villain. They are no longer the simplistic villain stereotypes, and instead more of an obvious extreme analogy to Middle Eastern terrorism based on religious extremism, which I do think makes it much better. But the funny thing about this episode is I remember when I first saw it, it upset me. I didn't like it as I thought it had potential and it went in the wrong direction. But watching it again, I can't for the life of me remember why I didn't like this episode and what my issue was with it, because now I think it's fine. Maybe I had different expectations the first time I watched it that I didn't meet. But so when I watched it the second time, I knew it was going to happen, so I was more willing to go with it. Again, I do think sometimes the comedy undermines the drama and suspense of the episode, but for the most part it works, as this is by far the most suspenseful edge-of-your-seat episode so far, and I think it does a good job at holding this tension, because Mercer and Malloy are in constant danger of being discovered, which would of course have dire consequences for them. Like the scene when they went to services and involved like the priest repeatedly stabbing a severed human head. That was a dark scene, and I think it did a lot to describe Krill culture, and also really raised the tension. I guess my biggest issue was the casual modern way that Mercer and Malloy were behaving, making it obvious that they weren't who they said they were, and that there was something off about them. I thought that was a bit silly. Also, I kind of get sending Mercer on the mission, but why send Malloy? That seems like a really stupid choice, and someone like Bortus or Ilaria would have been a much better suited for a mission like this, and honestly, I think it was done simply for comedic reasons. Although, I do have to say, I love the jokes about Avis. That made me laugh a lot, as Avis was the name of the Krill god or messiah or whatever, but of course it's also the name of a modern American car rental company, so Malloy had tons of jokes about Avis being a car rental place, which I found them all hilarious. And I didn't think it distracted from the tension of the episode. So my rating for Krill is an 8 out of 10. So next episode is Nosedive. Hated in the Nation. Majority Role. Yeah, that's it. Majority Role. So this episode is seen as a fan favorite, and many have said it makes bold and poignant commentary on modern society. And I kind of agree, but it is also way too derivative of a Black Mirror episode to not be considered a ripoff, at least in my opinion. In fact, this really closely resembles two Black Mirror episodes, the ones I just mentioned. The most obvious one being Nosedive, which is the episode with Bryce Dallas Howard, where society is dictated on social media score. This is so that is how many likes or dislikes a person receives, what the percentage of likes is, and if you have a really low score, you're considered pariahs, and you lose privileges and abilities to do things like fly on an airplane or purchase coffee. But this also closely resembles the Black Mirror episode Hated in the Nation, that was about a campaign run where people would trend a hashtag on who they think should be killed, and whoever gets the most votes is then murdered. This is similar in regards to its commentary on modern culture to crucify people in the court of public opinion, and that if they do something that the public sees as despicable, like disrespect to culture on live TV or dry hump a statue of a respected historical figure, this is then the internet will pronounce or pounce on that person, and which leads to ruining their lives. So basically, they'll assign judgment in the court of public opinion, which could have dire real-life consequences. Now, to be fair, this is a subject that Seth MacFarlane has spoken out against before. There was also an episode of The Family Guy that addressed this issue, so this is a subject that is likely important to MacFarlane and something he wanted to make commentary on. I just think its execution too closely resembles those Black Mirror episodes, particularly Nosedive. However, all that being said, I did find this episode enjoyable to watch, and an aspect of the commentary I really enjoyed that I think those Black Mirror episodes didn't touch on was the fact that in this culture, all facts were decided by majority opinion. This was kind of slipped in there as there was a newscast the girl was watching at the start of the episode indicates that what are considered facts are dictated by popular opinion instead of what is scientifically proven or what is actually real. And that is a real dangerous trend that is creeping up in modern day society, whether it be the whole claim of fake news that is often said about provable facts, or denialism in things like evolution or global climate change. The government and the media consider these non-factual positions valid simply because there's a large opinion base behind them. And that is dangerous. So I do like that this episode touched on that a bit. And I also like how this world didn't have lawyers. Instead they have publicists, and there were no courts, only the court of public opinion. Although I'm not sure how accurate this commentary is, as it ignores that a counterculture to this exists. For example, in season 5 of BoJack Horseman, they made commentary that implied the opposite is true, that celebrities and people were too easily forgiven for despicable things that they did. I think both opinions are valid, but neither one is the norm or always the case as depicted in this episode. So in that way, I did find the episode a bit simplistic in its absolutism view of the world that doesn't apply to modern day society as it's presented in this episode. Also, something about this episode itself that really annoys me is that it takes the Star Trek the original series tradition of them just so happening to come across a planet that is exactly like what is to modern day audiences Earth. And they even write it in some dialogue at the start of the episode to try to excuse this as a norm. This is so incredibly dumb. I find it highly annoying, even for a comedy. I also don't buy how easily that coffee shop girl's mind was changed and how it's implied that she's going back to the planet to try to change the culture for the good. Again, it feels a bit too simplistic and cartoonish. That being said, still enjoyed the episode, and I love that it was thought-provoking, even if it wasn't original. So I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. So next episode is Into the Fold, which takes on the glorious Star Trek cliche of having a shuttle crash episode, where a couple of main characters crash on a planet and have to survive. I don't like this cliche in Star Trek, so I certainly don't like it here. And the story with Dr. Finn being kidnapped by some creepy dude with the shelter that so happened to survive his world's apocalypse was way too derivative of 10 Cloverfield Lane, and it's not at all funny, so it's not a parody, so there's no excuse for this. It's just a ripoff. And overall, I would say that this episode's biggest crime is that it's simply not funny, nor is it particularly interesting, nor is it engaging. The only saving grace of this episode is the character interactions between Isaac and Dr. Finn's sons, which were really interesting, and it set up a cute dynamic, and I think it did a lot to develop Isaac's character. But again, this was very derivative of dozens of Next Generation episodes where Data developed a relationship with a kid, so no marks for originality there, but it was still interesting character interactions. So I'm going to give this episode a 4 out of 10. So next episode is Fascination, Cupid's Dagger. So This is the episode where Luoxana Troy comes on the station and makes everyone fall in love with each other and they act all creepy towards each other. This is the episode where Rob Lowe comes on the ship and makes everyone fall in love with each other and act all creepy with each other. Now, those familiar with the Deep Space Nine episode that I'm referencing will know that I don't like that episode at all, so you can imagine how I feel about an episode that simply rips it off. I suppose it works better as a comedy, since this is a comedy show and they do comedy better, and it's kind of amusing seeing Seth MacFarlane swooning over Rob Lowe. And I do like, by the way, the fact that these two are the same sex is never brought up as an issue in this episode. But I really don't like the retcon here that makes it so that when Kelly cheated on Ed, it was because of some strange alien hormones that mind controlled her. That to me diminishes that storyline and just comes off as a cheap redo. Not that I like that storyline in the first place, but it's obviously a retcon that they never thought of for the first part of the season. And the resolution where they use Rob Lowe's pheromones to make the two warring aliens fall in love was oh so predictable. I saw that ending coming from like a million miles away. But I guess now's as good as time as any to talk about Yaphet, a blob of green slime alien voiced by Norm Macdonald. I love this character, and I think the show itself picked on how well this character worked, and it's why he took a more prominent role towards the end of the season. Plus, I think having Norm Macdonald voice him is a stroke of brilliance. He's absolutely hilarious, and I must admit it was interesting seeing him finally get what he wants with Dr. Finn and it not being all it's cracked up to be. That was kind of interesting. Anyway, so 3 out of 10 for this episode. So next episode is Firestorm, and I didn't find that this episode ripped off any other episodes in particular, but was just generally unoriginal and predictable, as it's about Alara Katan and how she feels that she let her fear get the better of her, so she put herself in this training program where she had to overcome the many phobias of the cast of her shipmates. Of course, this was the twist ending that wasn't revealed until the end, and I felt as it was a really silly one, which I didn't really care for. And I did lose interest in this episode far before it was over. But I must say there were some really funny moments, such as the scary clown and all the jokes surrounding it. And I did find the scene with Dr. Finn trying to strap down and cut Ilaria effectively scary and creepy. And I thought Penny Johnson did a great job playing a psychopath. However, there is a scene towards the end of the episode where Ilaria is sort of running down the corridors, with the gun, and she's wearing a t-shirt or whatever. And it was so derivative of Aliens, but I think that was meant as an intentional homage, so I'll give that a pass, because I wouldn't most shows. It's just this show is so derivative of so many things, it gets a bit a bit overwhelming at times. But anyway, this episode was pretty forgettable, so 4 out of 10 for me. So next episode is New Dimensions, where again Orville decides to take some of the worst aspects of Star Trek and incorporate it into its own show. In this case, it's having a plot about a boring character story, and it's having an A plot about a boring character story and a B plot about some technobabble nonsense that nobody cares about. And again, I'm not very thrilled to see the Orville falling into the same traps that Star Trek did. So let's talk about the boring character story first, which in this case is Commander Grayson finding out that Lieutenant Lamar is actually a super genius, so she wants to make him the chief engineer. So first off, I do not buy this story at all. It's a very obvious retcon that doesn't fit at all with how this character has been previously established. Secondly, this is such a mirror and mimic of what they did with Geordi LaForge in Star Trek Next Generation, where in the first season he was the navigator and then he got promoted to chief engineer. It makes me wonder if this was planned all along as a homage to LaForge, or if they simply were running out of ideas and just ripping off the Next Generation, hoping no one will notice. What I mean to say is, did they plan from the start to have Lamar do the same thing that LaForge did, starting out as navigator and then being promoted to chief engineer? Or did they run into the same problem that Next Generation did, where they realized that not having a chief engineer as a main cast member was a mistake and that they needed one, so they were like, oh, let's pull a LaForge with Lamar. But then again, the names are very similar, so it makes me think he was always intended as a LaForge ripoff. But whatever. Either way, I didn't like it and I thought it was dumb. Also, there was another character story going on in this episode with Ed finding out that Kelly had recommended him for the job of captain, and his pride was hurt and he was second guessing himself. I hated this storyline. I hated this from the beginning when it was hinted at in the first episode that she suggested him. I just don't have time for it. Blech. Anyway, now as for the B plot, yeah, I don't really have much to say about this. The visuals were kind of cool, looked like Tron, but as a story, it was just a typical technobabble nonsense subplot that you'd find in any Next Generation or Voyager episode. In other words, crap. I mean, if they're going to do it as a parody show, they could make fun of it and point out that it's a throwaway B plot filled with technobabble nonsense to give the characters something to do, just so they can have a thread of the week. So if they actually had fun with that and made fun of the fact that Star Trek does that, and they could even have a character be like, oh, so we're in a B plot or something like that, then it might actually have worked. It might have been funny. It might have been good, but they didn't do that. They treated it like a legitimate plot the same way the Next Generation would. Therefore, it sucks just as much. So 2 out of 10 for me. So finally we get into Mad at Dilatory. Now, I almost did the same joke where I got the episode title confused with another episode that I thought this episode was ripping off. I almost did it with the Voyager episode Blink of an Eye, but that episode is often itself accused of being a ripoff of a classic sci-fi novel called Dragon's Egg. And I almost did it with the Next Generation episode Who Watches the Watchers, but then watching this episode I realized that it isn't a ripoff of Who Watches the Watchers, but it's more of a rebuttal. It does kind of feel like Seth MacFarlane watched Who Watches the Watchers and thought that that's not how things would actually go, so let me do an episode that really shows how things would go. As in Who Watches the Watchers, Picard was worried about a pre-warp culture worshipping him as a god, saying that it would ruin their culture and stagnate their progress. Whereas in this episode, Commander Kelly Grayson does become a god figure for a pre-warp culture, and in the end it's revealed that she didn't have any negative impact, and they just dismissed it as a normal growing pains that all cultures go through, and if it wasn't her, it would have been someone else. And I don't know which side that I side with. I can see MacFarlane's point, but something about the way this episode phrased it seems a bit douchey and makes me want to reject it. I don't know, it's hard to put into words. But this episode did have a really fascinating concept that does combine the ideas of Blink of an Eye and Who Watches the Watchers. Where in Blink of an Eye, where a whole alien world develops through like millennia in a time frame that for our main characters is only like a couple of months. And the idea of Who Watches the Watchers about a cultural contamination. So I'm not sure I agree with the don't worry, it's all good philosophy that this episode gives. And I do think it is possible that this could actually have negative impact on the permanent society. And I don't think if it's not her, it would have been someone else, is entirely accurate. I mean, I think there are nuggets of truth in there, but I don't think it's that simplistic. As for the episode itself, it was a fascinating sci-fi story, and it was really interesting to see them revisit this culture in various phases of its development. But typical to the Orville, it did have a lot of simplistic, cartoonish feel to it, because the characters in the world came off as cliches, not actual characters, and their behavior was a bit simplistic. But that being said, it does raise a lot of interesting and fascinating points, like how it shows when the priest was going to expose that Kelly wasn't really God, the other dude killed him because the belief wasn't the point was the power, and they were using this belief to grab power and to control people, which I love and I think is a really interesting message. And just overall seeing how the crew of the Orville dealt with this fantastical situation was really interesting to watch. But I didn't care for the subplot of Mercer and Grayson getting back together. Seems like a giant excuse to show why they couldn't have these characters get back together so the show can maintain its norm. Smash that reset button. Smash it. And overall, I don't care for the Kelly Grayson character overall. And I think the show would be better off without her. Just my opinion. Anyway, I'm going to give this episode an 8 out of 10. So that's all the episodes of Season 1 of the Orville. So now let me give my overall rating for the Orville Season 1 out of 10. And I'm going to give it a 7, very good. I overall enjoyed the show, as most of the time the comedy worked, and it had some fairly interesting characters, particularly the alien characters, which were well thought out science fiction characters that expand the imagination and display unique hypothetical cultures and the grand tradition of Star Trek. And many of the stories are fascinating, thought-provoking sci-fi stories, but the show has some serious issues with originality, and although sometimes this can be overlooked because it's a comedy parody show, but sometimes it can't, because sometimes you get the real sense it's not parodying something or making commentary on the Star Trek episode, but rather it's just retreading the same ground for dramatic effect and presenting it as if it was something original. Also, sometimes the comedy and drama don't mesh as well as they should, and the comedy gets in the way of the drama. Not most of the time, but some of the time. So, still, overall, I really enjoyed the Orville, but it's not one of the best shows I've ever seen. And for those familiar with my channel who may have noticed in my original review of the Orville, I gave Season 1 a 9. But yes, I'm dropping that to a 7 after analyzing it more closely and giving more thought into how well the season works. And for those thinking that it's a travesty that I gave Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery a higher grade because I gave that an 8, I have since also dropped Discovery's grade to a 7 after further reflection. So they're both 7s, and I still refuse to compare the two or say which one I like better because it doesn't matter. Anyway, that is it for my review of the Orville. I will be back after Season 2 has finished to give my thoughts on Season 2. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I review many more shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.